thanks everybody. Thank you for joining us. And thanks for waiting. We are fashionably on time.
Yes.
We are doing okay. Because we want Krishna to speak only for an hour. We have 1 hour for him. This. I was wondering how to start this introduction, and thanks to what Krishna said, two things that he said, I am mighty obliged to you. One is that he said that Mahatma Gandhi was 45 years old when he began his life, his actual contribution to the world. And it's no coincidence, I guess, that Krishna at 45 started writing this book. So we're waiting for him to lose some hair and a shirt. The other thing that he said about Indians abroad, completely unconnected story. I was teaching in Japan about 15 years ago, and this city of Kyoto. After the fourth day, something struck me. There is something that I'm missing. It happens to you. You don't know, you can't put a finger to it, but you're disturbed. So after a while, of tossing and turning and whatever, I realized, the reason I'm unhappy is because for the last 4 days, I haven't seen a single child. Japan is a bunch of old fogies. There are no children. I hadn't seen a child. It also must have been because my son was born a few days ago, so I was missing the child. So I went looking for children in Japan. Now, where do you go to look for children? I went to the zoo. I went to a couple of neighborhood parks. No children. I gave up. Went to the superstore to buy my, pizzas and whatever. And lo and behold, I heard a child crying. I was so happy. Finally I am hearing this. So I actually ran to that alley where the crying came from. And lo and behold, Indian child. So, Krishna is very dear and a very old friend. I don't know which is better. He is very old and very dear. And I've known him since he was in school. You often wonder about these young kids who you are very fond of. You want them to do something in life. And I kept waiting for Krishna to do something in life. He played cricket, did fairly well in college, got married to this lovely girl, had a great daughter. But we were still waiting for him to do something that we all will be remembered by. And then he went on and wrote this book. So thanks for doing that. The book itself is a book that I now know very well. I've been through a couple of these readings. It is something that invokes or reminds us of a lot of things in life. Remember, we were all fond of this time travel. We wanted to go back in history and find out how life was 2000 years ago, 500 years ago. Here is a book that takes us back in time. In that sense, it's remarkable literature. There are very few books like that where you actually go back in time. Alex Kelly wrote that famous Roots, which takes him back to Gambia, some 400 years. Gabriel Garcia Marquez took us back into Colombia 100 years ago. The Sea of Poppies takes us back a few hundred years. So it combines that time travel with a search for some magic of history, which you find in the God of Small Things. What this book does is that it combines all this lyricism into one little journey of a very remarkable man 100 years ago. So welcome back home to an audience that is interested in you and your story. Over to you for the rest of the time. Thank you.
In Hyderabad, my home, I heard a lot of stories from my grandmother. So the first good set of good stories was about my grandfather, who unfortunately died very young. So he died when my dad was just a baby. So my grandmother would tell stories about how my grandfather was a hardworking man. He was educated in South Africa, and she would say he had great handwriting. And there were some more stories about my great-grandfather, Viriah. Grandmother would say, your great-grandfather had a tragic ending to his life, and he somehow would remark that he met Gandhiji. As a middle school kid, I would not connect the dots about my grandfather or my great-grandfather and what did they have to do with Gandhiji. And there were yet another set of stories about my grandfather's sister. So my grandmother was a good storyteller. Like a master weaver, spinning colorful threads into a magical carpet, she would insert morals and lessons into these stories. Don't be profligate. Do not get carried away by false praises. Evidently, my great-grandfather trusted those who surrounded him and lost all his hard-earned money. She would say, when your great-grandfather stepped out of the ship with his sons, the ship captain remarked, Viriah, you will build a house with walls of gold. That sounded so dramatic that we would implore her to repeat that story often. It seems straight out of a fantasy movie, especially for children who were growing up in a small two-room rented flat with walls definitely not made of gold. So this was a small apartment in Bazarghat for those who are from Hyderabad. So that's how I grew up, listening to a lot of these stories. And it was an interesting family tree project. I was curious to know about my grandfather, about my great-grandfather. I would try to put all this family tree together. And in the late 1990s, I became more interested. By that time I was through college. And then I started writing to the embassies. So I wrote to the South African embassy, who put me through to some researchers, and I was asking them, I want to know about my great-grandfather. And one of those researchers said, Krishna, it is very difficult to get information about indenture coolies. And that was the first time I heard this word called indenture. And I looked it up online, and what I read shook me up. 1.3 million, that is 13 lakh Indians, were shipped off as indentured labor to replace slaves. So 1.3 million Indians again. And they were sent to the Caribbean, the West Indies, they were sent to South Africa, Mauritius, and Fiji. And from India, you had only two ports, Calcutta and Madras, from where they would ship all these coolies. So life of indentured labor was almost like that of a slave. They would work dawn to dusk. You could get whipped for no reason. Your pay and rations could get hurled because of the whims and fancies of the farm owners. The female coolies would get abused all the time. And on the screen you are seeing a photograph. So this photograph is a famous photograph in the indenture studies. So you would notice that all these people don't have any names, they just have the number. So, which is their indentured number. And I'm looking at this photograph. I'm by this time trying to think about my great-grandfather. And then one fine evening, it struck me that my great-grandfather was one of them. So that was the night that I cried for him, because Till that time, it was more of a family tree. I'm trying to connect with my family. But the moment I realized that he is one of those indentured coolies who were shipped off, then the project was no longer a family tree project. It was more to know myself. It was more to know my great-grandfather who was on one of those ships. So thus began almost a 2-decade-long journey to search for my great-grandfather. So it began with ship lists. So you had some researchers who put the list of all the coolies who went from India, so whether from Madras or Calcutta, to these countries, and they digitized them. So I bought the different ship lists, I put all the lists together, and I created one Excel sheet of 150,000 rows. Because you had about 150,000 coolies who went to South Africa. And I would look for people whose names sounded like Viriah, and if I found some names, I would send them to the researchers and then wait for a month or two for these people to find out something from the archives. Then they would come back and say, no, he died there, or he had only 2 children. And I knew that my great-grandfather had 6 sons. So then I would ask my grandmother about what could be the time period when he might have gone there. And she couldn't give me a precise time. All she would say is, he used to say that maybe he went there as a youngster. So now on this list, I removed everybody who was more than 16 or 17 years of age. And then I looked at people only less than 16. So that took, again, a few months and years where I would look for a name and then who sounded familiar to Viriah, send it to the researchers in South Africa, wait for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, it wouldn't come. And during this journey, I realized that the coolies who stepped off the boat, so imagine being on an ocean for 3 months or 4 months in a very crowded ship. So when you landed, the name is what was in the register. It would be written by an officer and how he understood it. So these coolies, irrespective of whichever part of India you were from, you would say your name is Krishna, but after 4 months on the ship, you are tired, you don't know what the officer is asking you, you blurt out something. So, and then the pronunciation was what the officer would have heard. So in the list, the names itself were not correct. And also what happened is most of the coolies, or some of them, they changed their caste. So when they got off the boat, they could have said my last name is a Singh or a Shastri. So from a lower caste, you could become a higher caste just by saying that you are from that caste. So the list itself was not perfect, which I knew, but then the struggle goes on and on. Later on, the South African government, they opened up a database of all the interactions they had with some of the coolies, so I kept searching for them. And the picture is of King Sisyphus. In Greek mythology, King Sisyphus was punished with being forced to roll an immense boulder up a hill for it to roll down when it neared the top, repeating this action for eternity. My Sisyphean struggle with the ship lists went on for a few more years. I would end each attempt by dropping off all the short lists and start fresh all over again. The cycle of hope, attempt, failure, despair, dream, and restart went on for years. And at last, in December 2014, I gave up. It was the 20th of December 2014. I told Bindu, my wife, that I wanted to go to South Africa. She was silent for a long time. Why? She asked. The search is over. I failed. But at least I can meet my niece and nephew, and maybe I'll feel better if I stand on the same ground that my great-grandfather did. Where will you stay? She asked. I don't know. I'll figure out something. With just one address in Thu Oct, Natal, a rough sketch of the family tree, a zillion butterflies in my stomach, and a prayer on my lips, I boarded a South African Airways flight from JFK to Johannesburg. The 16-hour flight felt like eternity. The images from my childhood, countless conversations with grandmother, the dark maze of the ship lists, the innumerable futile attempts, the fleeting hope I might find my great-grandfather somehow overwhelmed me. After a 2-hour layover in Johannesburg, I took the much shorter 1-hour flight to Durban. My heartbeat grew louder and I was sweating profusely as the plane approached Durban. So I land in Durban. I find this relative of mine, and then I go to their home. And on the first day, I ask them, "Can you take me to the archives?" So imagine a family which is trying to find you after maybe say a couple of generations. They find you, and the first thing they're asking you is, "Can you take me to an archive?" So these people thought I was crazy, and but they obliged anyway. So this place is the archive in Pietermaritzburg. Pietermaritzburg, again, relevant more so because of Gandhiji. This was the city where Gandhiji was pushed out of the train. So 7 days after landing in South Africa in 1893. So I go to this archive, and then I'm telling the same story to the research associate that I want to find my great-grandfather. She asks, "Okay, did you look at the ship lists?" And I say, "Yeah, I did. It doesn't work." And in that archive, in a way, a miracle happened. So I hope you'll read the book for the entire half an hour of that miracle. But in brief, this is what happened. So about 15-20 minutes before closing the archives, this was 24th of December, so which is Christmas Eve, which is a very big festival. So most government offices worldwide and in South Africa are closed from 20th December onwards. And this office was open on a festival, and she kept it open for almost past time. And then she told me, "Maybe you could look at the list of the coolies who went back." And I said, "That would be great." But then the time was almost over. Now you can close the door. And she got me a register to look at, but by then the clock struck 12. 0, zilch. The game was over. The entire search was for nothing. I kicked myself for planning this crazy trip to begin with. I should have been with my wife and daughter for the holidays, and here I was in this reading room, still looking for a needle in a field of haystacks. How many times did grandmother try to tell you to give it up? Serves you right. Zip. The entire journey, with all its highs and lows, swished through me. All the dreams I had of connecting with my roots to find my great-grandfather had come to naught. By this time it was past noon, and the receptionist and other staff were getting impatient. It was time to close the office. "Sorry, grandmother, I lost. I failed you," I said. It was time to face the truth. I could not find my roots. With tears welling up in my eyes, I stood up to leave. Alas, the search had finally ended. As I stood up, I looked within myself for one last time. I scraped the barrel of my soul to see if there was any speck of hope left. There was one tiny fading fragment left at the bottom. I begged the assistant for a few more minutes, knowing fully well it was impossible to search the rest of the register. She pointed at the clock. The diabolical clock would not stop. It was now past 12. To this day, I cannot remember which of my incoherent mumbling pleas were. She sighed. "One last register." "Absolutely, okay?" So I said, "Yes, ma'am." "What year do you want to search?" I stared blankly at her, hopeless, enervated and lost. "I don't know. Maybe you can pick a date." She quickly came back with the register for 1932. I looked at the clock. It was 12:15, past 15 minutes past the archive's official closure time on Christmas Eve. Oh no, I was crestfallen. 1932 definitely was not the year he returned to India. I was positive. With all the calculations we had done, this was easily a decade or more off. But I told myself it would be impolite, at least not to look at the register. And robotically, I pretend to search. And it was 12:30 p.m. It was half an hour past closing time. The lights clicked off. The other staff members started walking towards the door, and the research assistant politely and firmly pointed out yet again that the time was up. I folded my hands and begged for just one more minute. A staff member pulled out her keys and was readily walking toward the door. I held on to the register like a person drowning in an ocean clinging to a life preserver. Suddenly I paused. On the page, 7 or 8 passenger names seemed familiar. My heart stopped and I turned pale. Staring at me were the names of my great-grandfather and his children. Viriah! I was paralyzed. I kept staring at that page blankly. It was not real. Obviously, it could not be. The thoughts and memories of all the endless nights poring over the ship list, the circuitous attempts, all the prayers, the pleadings, came together in a deafening crescendo. Lightheaded, I looked at the names carefully again. A gazillion fireworks went off in my head. My grandmother was with me in the room that day, for there was my family written in black ink on the page. So I found the original ship record of my great-grandfather. So this miracle I still can't explain as to how it happened, as to why she picked that date. But once I found it, the search for my roots that began when I was a child ended when I was 44. And as Amir pointed out, I started writing the book the following year. So I could put the whole puzzle together as to when was he born, when did he go to South Africa, and when did he return. And the following day, yet another miracle happened, and this was on Christmas. So in a very busy Johannesburg airport, I met my father's first cousin, and she was 74 then, and till this date, I can't explain the miracle as to how in less than a minute in that crowded airport I find her. So for the first few minutes, we cried more than we laughed, and she kept on saying that I waited all my life to see somebody from my mother's side. And today's book reading, out of all the 14 I did globally, is in a way very special because I have this aunt's younger sister in the room with me today. So that's Chinaka. So she's with me here today. And so with my her elder sister in the airport in that 1 hour, she filled in a couple of pieces of that puzzle. So where she was saying in Telugu, "Mi Muttata Sardar Sardar." So in the sugarcane farms, you would have the coolies, and the Sardar was the one who would run the farm. So evidently, my great-grandfather started off as a coolie, and maybe after the first 20 years, he becomes a Sardar. So my grandmother would say, your great-grandfather, they would call him a boiler Sardar. And all this while, I couldn't understand what was this old woman saying. And now, with the guy in that airport, she says, your great-grandfather was a Sardar. So it was that amazing moment in the airport where she fills in the rest of the story. And while I was going off, she took her ring from her finger, and she said, "Krishna, this is for your daughter." It was overwhelming, and I keep thanking God every day that I got reunited with my family. And thank you, Chinaka, for coming over. This makes it very special. Thank you. And this is the first time Chinaka is visiting India and Hyderabad, the place of her roots, and with her 3 lovely daughters. And at last the families reunited. So my dad went to South Africa. That is the picture on top. The bottom one is yesterday when Chinaka landed in the airport, and we went to pick her up. So the family tree is now in place. And but I thought it's interesting to ask the question as to why did the Indian sugar slavery happen in the first place. So 3 parts to this story. Something about India, something about slavery, and something about sugar history. So by the year 350, during the golden age, during the Gupta period, in India, you had the technology to process sugar. Right? But then the entire race for sugar all started around 1440s when a Portuguese sailor, he picked up 2 Africans of the coast, and he takes them as a gift to his king, and thus started slavery in modern times. So in 1493, you had Christopher Columbus, who took slaves and sugarcane to Hispaniola, which is the modern day Dominican Republic and Haiti. And by 1600, you notice on the top, 2 things happened. So in India, Charminar actually was completed. It was 1591. So a decade before 1600, you had Charminar, so which hopefully you'll get to see tomorrow. And, and another event happened where the East India Company, a group of British merchants, were asking permission to trade from the Indian emperor. At the same time, in Europe, you had a fancy wedding happening where Maria Medici, from a very rich Italian family, was marrying King Henry IV of France. In that wedding, the biggest show was the sugar sculptures. So what was happening was sugar was a precious commodity reserved only for the rich and famous, and most of the sugar was grown in the Caribbean and Brazil. So from Africa, you had 13 million slaves. That is 13 million slaves were taken from Africa. 75% of them went to Brazil. And they all went to work on sugarcane. So it was sugarcane that was the cause for modern day slavery. So by 1600, it is more for the rich and famous, but you notice by 1700, the upper middle class start having tea. And one of the important products that the British East India Company, which by 1700, by 1757, it was becoming more and more powerful, the product that they were exporting was tea. So more and more people start drinking tea and coffee, so they want sugar, so which means more sugarcane farms, which means more slaves. So slavery taking deep roots, most of the slaves in Brazil and Caribbean. And if you notice on the top, in 1757, a very important event happens in India. So in the Battle of Plassey, the East India Company, they overthrow the Nawab of Bengal. So Bengal as a state was richer than all of England. And once the East India Company defeat the Nawab of Bengal in 1757, within less than 100 years, they run through rest of India. But what is interesting to our story is that by this time, the middle class people start having sugar. So which means the price of sugar is falling, which means more and more people want sugar, which means more and more sugarcane farms and more slaves. By 1834, another big event happens in history where slavery is abolished. So slavery is abolished officially in the British Empire in 1834, And then the plantation owners, they go to the queen and say, you take all these slaves away, so who is going to work in these farms? So, if you notice on the top, between 1760 and 1860, in that 100 years, you had 35 million Indians who died in only 5 famines. So, in the previous times, the kings or the nawabs, if you are lucky to have a good king or a nawab, he would probably forgive your taxes and probably build a mosque or a temple or a fort to give employment. But in the British Empire, all they wanted was their revenues. So you had to work. And after these famines, by 1850s, in India, you had a lot of people in poverty. You had the local industry, which was destroyed. So you had people from handloom industry looking for work. So this was the timing where around 1850s, lot of Indians poor, desperate for work, and lot of sugarcane farms which need almost free labor. So all these come together, and then they create the system called indenture, which was slavery with just a different name. So in 1834, the first ship, which carried about 34 coolies, went to Mauritius, setting off the Indian indenture. And if you think of how they recruited this 13 lakh coolies, it's a very interesting study as to in India, in those times, such a vast country, but how did they manage to recruit all these people? And I'll read another short snippet now. By this time, my great-grandfather Viriah, a youngster, he has run off from home. So he's looking for work in a place called Vijayawada. A few weeks later, a trip to the temple changed his life forever. When he walked up, he saw a large crowd gathered near the temple. In the middle of the crowd stood an English officer dressed in a suit and a hat, and a drummer stood next to him, pounding out dum-duma-dum, dum-duma-dum to announce their presence. The clerk held up a poster for all the crowd to see. Pani, 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 nelakaidu rupayalu. In Telugu, work, 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 5 rupees per month. The clerk continued, food and rations will also be given. Egged on by a starving stomach, Viriah's mind raced furiously. The daily wages for a coolie was 3 annas. In a month, it was impossible to find work on all days. He was thinking, there is something more to it. 5 rupees a month did look suspiciously high. But mingled in the crowd was a Arkati. So Arkati were recruiters who did this dirty job of getting suspicious and people and putting them onto the ship. Viriah could not fathom this idea of some strange ship and 5 rupees. He was confused and he walks back to his spot under the tree. The Arkati followed him and he said, you don't look like you are from Vijayawada. Viriah glanced at him. He wanted to be left alone. You look like a nice man, the stranger said. A faint smile escaped Viriah's lips. Smelling a catch, the Arkati lit a bidi and said, where are you from? Korlapadu, Viriah said. The Arkati said, I know somebody from that place who went to Natal and made a lot of money. The bait was tempting for the fish. But 5 rupees, that's a lot. Do they really pay 5 rupees? Absolutely, the Arkati said. You don't know the English government. There's a paper for every coolie with the salary and it has a queen's seal on it. He paused to let the effect of the queen's royal seal sink in. So my great-grandfather thinks this contract is real and then he boards the ship. The voyage on the ships was less than pleasant. The ships usually would take 3 to 4 months, sometime longer, on rough ocean journeys. Now, is there anybody in the room who has not heard of Indenture? The Titanic. So Titanic, the movie is popular, the story is still popular. But then in 1859, something happened in Indenture, right, which I call it the Indenture Titanic. There was a ship carrying about 400 coolies and 75 crew members. which was going from Calcutta to Mauritius. So the ship sank on the way. They rescued all the 75 crew members. So the number of coolies who were saved was 0. So the ship's name was Shah Alam, and it's sad that there are hardly any history books which talk about the Indenture Titanic. So if you look at the number of coolies who would die on these ships, it was almost a fifth. So these poor coolies would die on the ship because of disease or infection, and in the middle of the night, they would just throw off these bodies into the ocean. And something more interesting happens on these ships. The name of the ship on which my great-grandfather went was called the Umkuzi. The Umkuzi was a huge melting pot of people from all religions, castes and colors. Golla, shepherd; Chamar, untouchable leather workers; Dhobi, watchmen; Kumhar, potters; Brahmin, the highest caste in Hinduism; Sayyid, Muslims with noble ancestry; Kasab, a Muslim butcher; Teli, an oil presser, and more. On the ship, all these people had to share that same small space. In most part of the country, in those days, the lower caste people were forced to live outside the village, and the Brahmins would not even touch them. But on the ship, it would not be the same. The Brahmins and the Rajputs started protesting initially. They refused to drink water from the same drum, but very soon they realized that thousands of years of social structures and customs crumbled at the Indenture altar. On the ship, they all blended into one shade, poor and desperate for a better life. They had become Jehaji Bhais, or ship brothers. And after they landed, there was this cruel practice where if you were a family in that noise, if a wife gets separated from the husband, they would get allocated to different farms. And there was no way for them to get together again. And in a lot of cases, we had families which never got reunited. And once you land in Durban, you would have to walk to your farm. And my great-grandfather walked about 76 kilometers. So he went to a farm in a place called Stanger. And whether you are a pregnant woman or an old person or a young child, these coolies just had to walk. And life on the farm, it was, as I said, began in the early morning, where you would have a very shrill whistle, a horn, and these coolies would get to the farm, and if the work was not good, you would get whipped. And these are just very few photographs, sadly, exist of those times. So there is this one photograph where these coolies are actually waiting for their payment, and it would always depend on your luck as well. So if the Sardar was in a good mood, you would get paid. And this is one of those days where now Viriah, my great-grandfather, by this time he has settled down in the farm and he's working. It rained incessantly all day, and the coolies were at work with little protection from nature's elements. Drenched to the bone, they returned to the barracks to find that the firewood was wet, which meant only cold mealies to satisfy their hunger. Mealies is corn. So these coolies would usually have some corn and some vegetables and some rice. And because it had rained, no firewood, so they can't cook. The next morning, Viriah woke up feeling as if his body was on fire and shivered like a thin leaf on a stormy night. The leaky roof let in a steady storm of raindrops. He was too weak to move, and as he lay there, he missed his mother more than ever. During the rainy season, young Viriah would play with his friends all day in the rain and usually returned home thoroughly wet and shivering. Papamma would quickly make hot kashayam, an Indian home remedy for colds, by boiling milk and sprinkling in turmeric, black pepper, ginger, cloves, and cumin. She would serve it to Viriah with tender love, pleading with him not to play in the rain for so long. Then she would scold the rain for not stopping all day long and for troubling her love, which delighted Viriah, who would already be thinking of the games for the next day. Teary-eyed, Viriah felt his mother's warm kashayam in his throat and gulped empty air, remembering her feeding him. And lastly, about the coolie woman, in all this journey, I think the real heroes were the coolie women. These were those poor, mostly illiterate, lowly skilled women who were trying to look for a better life, and they had to face so much of abuse and hardship right from the time they were recruited. And these women are going to a place where the language is different, the culture, the food, everything is different. And they would work hard on the farm and they would get paid only half wages. So, Ramsha and Raja, right? Half wages, half rations for the same amount of work. And on the weekends, they would work on these, say, they would grow some vegetables and sell. And it is because of their sacrifices, it is because of their hardship, you have about 45 lakh Indians in these countries today. So you have some of the more famous Indian progeny. So you have Alvin Kalicharan, a very famous cricketer from Guyana. Sundar Popo, he is the founder of Chutney music. Sundar Popo is a god for those who like Bhojpuri and Hindi and English music from Trinidad. You have Anirudh Jagannath, Prime Minister of Mauritius. And then Nicki Minaj, I think all the youngsters would know Nicki Minaj. Nicki Minaj's grandfather was one of the coolies who went from UP and went to Trinidad. And V.S. Naipaul, who won a Nobel Literature Prize, he is from Trinidad. You had Vijay Singh from Fiji, and the list goes on and on. So you have about 4.5 million Indians who live in these countries today. And before I close, sadly we don't learn from history. So what my great-grandfather went through, you have conditions which are fairly similar in a system what is called as kafala in the Middle East. So if you look at the 6 countries which are called the GCC countries, their population is roughly 57 million, out of which close to 8 million are Indians. And in the Indians, at least half of them are the lowly skilled people, if not more. So that makes it at least 4 to 5 million Indians are living the life which is fairly close to what my great-grandfather did. So in the middle, the picture that you're seeing is where they are in a hurry to get on to that bus, right? Because if they miss the bus, they can't go to the site. And for that, you won't get 1 week's wages. And these people live like 6 to 8 people in a room, and that is all the space that they have for maybe 5 years or 10 years or 15 years that they stay in the Middle East. So these people would work in this very hot conditions. They would get 2 breaks a day. And I keep thinking that, what my great-grandfather went through 150 years ago, as human beings, we don't learn. So, thank you very much. And the website is on, so you could read more, give some feedback, and the book is available on Amazon. We got some copies. And now, maybe 10-15 minutes, we can have some question and answers or some discussion. Thank you.
I would certainly have done all that. It's very informative, a lot of learned tonight. And thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you very much, Krishna, for bringing back my memories of my great-grandfather as well. And I appreciate for your hard work. Both of my parents were known on my and the background of the good family. Thank you very much. And may God bless you.
in 2014 December is where around Christmas I have the miracle, I find my roots, and in early 2015 I start telling a lot of my friends that I found my family, and my great grandfather was an Indenture coolie, and I realized very few people heard about Indenture and as to why it happened. So that was the time where I have another elder brother called Hussein, who some of these people know, and I told him the story, and he said, "You should write." So that was the trigger, and I thought I should start writing. So I started writing in 2015, but being a software and analytics person, it was not easy. I had a lot of material around indenture, numbers, research. So for the first 2 or 3 years, it was a lot of writing, and in the 4th year, in 2019, I got lucky and I got an editor. So she helped me structure the book, and I realized that some professional help was needed, and I got lucky to get the right kind of editor, and had a lot of friends who read the book, helped shape it. So Rashid is another good friend who changed the whole story just exactly a month before it was supposed to be printed. He was the one who came up with this appendices idea. So previously it was all one story, so where I had a character who would tell the history of South Africa and so on. So what he said is, keep the main story and then break up into appendices. So that way anybody who wants to know about Gandhiji and South Africa, we have a chapter. Somebody who wants to know history of South Africa. So that's how the structure came through. But very thankful to that editor. So that lady, she worked hard for a year. So in 2019, early parts, that's when the book got.
So what other nationalities do you find apart from India? Do you see others, or were they all Indian? The indentured labor?
In the indentured labor, so the question was, were there other nationalities? So you actually had some Chinese as well, who were part even of that slave trade which happened, who went to the Caribbean. But numbers wise, they were much lesser. So you had some of these Chinese labor which went to the US, some to the Caribbean. But, the Indian coolies was the largest. And it still surprises me that in those days, these guys had the supply chain to figure out how do you put 13 lakhs. So if you think about it, that would make it 500 coolies every week for 70 long years. Yeah.
Because the challenge is also, because the British colonized so many countries in the world.
Yeah.
The British colonized so many countries in the world, it was easier to get Indian labor. Whether they call indentured in 1860 or today they called it labor workers.
Yeah.
I mean, when you were speaking, I was just thinking that Hyderabad is the capital of IT. I don't think just in India, Southeast Asia, maybe even the world.
Yes.
But we are using different terminologies, but actually doing the same thing in another form and way. Because labor broking today, in this day and age, is the highest form of slavery.
Agree? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask why Danny couldn't make it. Your niece, right?
The niece that you got in touch, why she not here?
Oh man, thank you. No, so they are talking about Dene.
I think my father had passed away at the time. Yes.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, someday.
No, I hope one day Dene will come. So thank you.
Krishna, your grandfather's journey and then your journey in search of peace history was marvelous and beautifully explained here. And I wish that one more family of those 1.2 billion people in touch with you will know that this research you have done can take the satisfaction that you see that yes, my effort has helped one more family to reach their great grandchildren.
Thank you.
I know Kanaya from childhood. A kid, a cricket enthusiast, and whatnot. He has everything in his domain, I can say, to become a scientist that time itself. Same thing is good, his elder sister and youngest as well. I want to find out one thing here, Krish. Are you really Krishna or Viriah? Because it is difficult for any human being at this particular time to research, to go back, to find out grandfather, great grandfather, and all. After seeing that register where great grandfather's name is there, and apart from that, he has his family members also. And somehow I thought you are not Krishna, you are Viriah.
Thank you, thank you.
Has anyone approached you for film movie rights?
I can add to that, Mira. A biggest fan of this book is Nazir sir. You all must be aware of him.
Oh, really?
Nazir, yeah.
Yeah.
He is promoting the book more than us.
Oh, wow, that's great.
So most probably he should be working on film rights and stuff. So he is guiding us on that.
Very literate and erudite. So he read the roots, he knew the characters, he knew the whole thing. He says Viriah is like Kairaba Kunta Kinte. So so 2-3 and then I had to drive to Kurnool. So in the 2 days I'm here, one day I had to go to Kurnool. So he said, now can we meet? So we drove for 4-5 hours, and then we spent like half an hour together. So I'm happy that he read the book, and he was saying I shot films in Fiji and Mauritius.
Wow.
So he's saying now I know why these people went there. He was in Johannesburg he's an actor, so he was in Johannesburg for about 10 days for a movie, and he said, oh, I saw a lot of Naidus, but he said, now your book helped me connect the dots as to why these people went. Thank you.
Krishna's book is amazing. Yeah, his perseverance is amazing actually. The way he brought it down is fantastic. And I'm sure not many people in this world have that kind of perseverance to find his roots and present it to the world. And my daughter is a 7th grader, now she's an 8th. But last year when I read the book, I told a few of the things to her name is Ramani. I told a few of the instances in the book to her. And then she's a very good reader. She's like, Mom, can I read the book? And I'm like, yeah, sure. She picked up the book and the next 2 days she was on it. She didn't leave the book. And then she was so amazed at how he got, she was amazed at his journey actually. Yeah, I think I could have brought her, but I came directly from the office, so I couldn't bring her here. But she just absolutely loved the books.
So sadly, in India, the archives are in a very, very poor shape. So whether it is in Tamil Nadu, a few exist in Delhi and Calcutta, but by and large, the archives are in a very poor shape. So one of my dreams is now maybe to collect the information from archives in South Africa and Mauritius and Fiji and put it all together. But as we stand, it is very low. But in the last 2-3 years, some excitement with this whole Pravas Bharatiya events happening. So at least there is some excitement. So there is some group, some office in Delhi, apparently in the Ministry of External Affairs, called Pravas Bharatiya Research Wing. So I don't know whether I can get hold of somebody, but if there was a way to get the archives moving, whatever is left in India and these countries, that would be nice.
Why I am saying is there is lots of diaspora events happening around this for a couple of years. So it will be good if anybody could do some work so that people will get
Oh, no, absolutely. So you'll be surprised. In this last 4-5 years, I met so many Indians from South Africa, from Guyana and so on, who are trying to find their families in India. And we don't have an easy way. We don't have the resources.
Since we are talking about preserving and rediscovering our architecture like that, everything starts with people writing about things from the past and taking it forward. So my question is, I heard this in some interview which I can't remember who said this, but they said that the most unbiased history that has ever been written by historians comes from France. Someone said this, and I think as far as the World War and all these things, whatever you take World War or any history, whatever mythology or whatever it is, to some extent we feel that a lot of it is biased towards some sect or someone or something like that. But someone said that French people write more unbiased history as far as any history is concerned. So my question is, in our country, as far as our history is concerned, when someone writes unbiased something like this, I'm sure, because I'm here only because honestly sir, I haven't read the book, but I must say that when someone speaks from the heart, I can understand it. So I'm asking this question. I never asked this question to anyone because I know, because when I ask this question, they'll always take sides, most of the people, and I haven't found, in my life at least, I haven't found that there are many unbiased people. But I'm asking this because I find you unbiased, so I'm asking this, if someone has to record or write something like that, so how can he be unbiased even if he is tempted to take sides, and what can be done to for us in our generation as you to remain unbiased and not get influenced by the media who are already sold to some political party or something like that before whatever.
Good question. So for the current generation, right, I think it is important to pause and think of the context, right, as to what you're trying to do. And one part is this whole culture of consumption. So we should look at, if you look at a phone, right, I think at least for this generation, they should ask as to where is the raw material, what comes into it, right? So for every cell phone you make, there are at least about 8 precious metals, if I know my math correct. For those excavation of those, only those 8 materials, it is done mostly in Burma, right? And the mines are a disaster. I mean, it is extremely dangerous. Something like kafal, right? So, or when you think of a fancy shoe, youngsters should ask, okay, is this shoe being made comfortably or by young children in a sweatshop in Bangladesh? So the more you ask, so if you think of a swanky mall, right? So when you think of Dubai, everybody thinks, malls, everything. But people should pause and think, well, these malls didn't come up overnight, right? Absolutely. So a lot of people had to work. So the more youngsters, at least the current generations, thinks of that context, a phone. So whatever you are consuming, do I really need fancy t-shirts like 10 pairs, or do I need to change a phone every 6 months? If you ask those questions, in my mind, you can work backwards and say, man, this has to stop. Exactly 3 more minutes, and then we would have set a record for at least ending on time.